All right, Tim, I see you out there, man. If you can go ahead and take yourself off of mute and turn on your video, we are right about ready to start.
All right.
Hey, beautiful, man. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm all right. So I am trying something new, right? I'm in this co-working space in Tampa, this new like swanky space, and all it does is make me feel old, brother.
Well, I am in my office at home, which has been for the last few weeks has served as my studio as well. I suddenly have become aware of Zoom backgrounds every time I turn on the television and watch a news program with talking heads. I'm checking out what they have behind them, bookshelves and plants and whatnot.
Well, it looks very nice. Mine is an actual genuine background. And the apparently the entrepreneur party that you hear in the background is also very real because that's what swanky people in Tampa do. Well, hey, so we've got folks coming on. So Tim, just to give you a little bit of background, the folks that are joining us today are capped at 100. So we will not have more than 100 people. It's a first come, first serve webinar. That's kind of how I like to engage with my audience. But the recording will obviously be shared with anybody who's interested. So yes, I wanted to tell you that. And then second, we're going to get a series of questions, Tim, throughout the entire interview. And I'll pull up those questions on my side and call them out as I see them. So for everybody else who's on the call, you are familiar with how these normally work, right? So the chat box is on and the chat box is open for everybody. But Tim and I won't be checking the chat box. That's really there for you folks to communicate with each other, to ask any questions that you have of each other, to give your opinions and give your thoughts. If you have a question for me or Tim, the way to ask us is to use that Q&A button that's right about here on your screen. Or if you're on mobile, I think it's somewhere over here or possibly over here. But either way, if you hit that Q&A, I'll get a notification and I'll know to pull up the Q&A and be able to ask that question. If I don't get to your exact question, it might be because I'm compiling questions together if multiple people are asking the same question. But that's how we're going to move forward. All right, so Tim, I'm super excited to chat with you, man, because you know, Everyday Spy, and you know that for me, espionage is just a way of life, right? Spying is my everyday business and I love it. But what I really enjoy about looking at it through your eyes is you take a historical context. And when you apply history to spying, you have to consider the human factor just as much as the tradecraft factor, because every individual human has a story that leads to their own espionage experience.
Right. And I think the girls in my book have sort of bring a unique perspective and background that fact.
Yeah, so the girls that we're talking about, Tim, so I just pulled up a quick screenshot to show folks the cover of your new book, Three Ordinary Girls. And this is kind of the context of our conversation today, their story, how they kind of accidentally fell into espionage in the Netherlands during World War II, and how they were successful, or what was successful and what was not successful. But yeah, that's the backdrop, I guess, for our conversation. So hearing their story is something that I really want to make sure everybody gets to hear, because like you and I have talked about, it has such pertinence. It's so relevant to the world that we live in today.
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that I call them ordinary girls, it's really something of a misnomer, because their lives turned out to be anything but ordinary. They were typical girls of North Holland at that time, and they were drawn into the conflict by various means, and their lives were changed irrevocably by what happened once they were drawn into existence.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tim, I'm going to ask you to speak up if that's okay, man.
Okay.
That might be on my side to be fair, but
I have a tendency to drop my voice at the end of a sentence sometimes, so I have to be reminded to get close to the microphone, speak into the microphone.
Perfect. Well, hey man, so I'm gonna switch over. I'm gonna pull up some of the pictures of the girls, and what I'd love to do is just kind of start with some thoughts that you have or some background that you can give us. Who are these three typical, extraordinary but typical girls? What is the time frame that we're talking about? What point in history are we looking at here with their story?
Uh, would you mind if I read a little bit of a presentation? I'll try not to make it too formal, but this will answer your questions and sort of give background to the girls and how they initially got involved.
Absolutely, man. Go for it.
Okay, and is this whoops? Well, I just goofed up your. Uh, is it all right if I share the screen with you?
Sure. Let me give you that capability. Hold on one second.
That way I can run the presentation myself.
Yeah, man. Go ahead. You should have control.
All right. Let me see. Do you have the image? Are we?
Oh, you want to control my screen? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. If that's hard for you to do, you can control the.
Yeah, you go ahead because I made some slight edits to it.
Oh, okay. Oh, all
just
right.
Yeah, just to make it, just to frame it up. For
you can follow. Yeah, yeah. Just follow along as you hear this, and you'll get the sense of where I'm going with it.
You got it.
Three Ordinary Girls is the story of three young women who became fighters in the Dutch resistance after the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940. When I call them ordinary, I don't mean that they weren't individual, that they didn't have their own unique characteristics, their quirks, their likes and dislikes. Instead, what I want to suggest is how drastic were the changes about to overcome them. In a matter of months, these young women, whose daily lives are typical of young people in North Holland at the start of the German occupation, were about to become integral members of the Dutch resistance and ultimately assassins. They would begin to risk everything that they loved and cherished. They would soon be risking their freedom, their families, their very lives for causes that had been largely theoretical to them a few months earlier. Understanding just how and why this happened was the chief animating force behind this book, and in the end became the story itself. Two of the girls, this is the first image you saw there, labeled, Andrew, if you could go back to that first image that was on the screen. Yeah, two of the girls were teenage sisters from Haarlem, a city not far from Amsterdam in North Holland. Truus, the older of the two on the right here, was just 16 years old at the time of the invasion. Freddie, her younger sister, was only 14. The two had grown up in a working class, politically active household in Haarlem. Their father left the family when the girls were quite young, leaving them with their mother, Treintje, a strong-willed, independent woman and active member of the local Communist Party. The family experienced the hardships of the Great Depression as the girls grew up, periodically going on the dole to make ends meet. Their education and social lives were wrapped up in the political leanings of their mother, whose friends and acquaintances were largely members of the party. The girls went to summer camps with children of other leftists. They read inspirational stories of life in the Soviet Union, and from an early age helped try to distribute party newspapers and flyers. The family was also part of the communist-founded organization called Red Aid, which assisted refugees from political oppression. As early as 1934, they were taking in individuals and families from Hitler's Germany, both communists and Jews. The girls were fiercely anti-fascist and fiercely anti-Nazi before the Germans crossed the border into the Netherlands. The third ordinary girl, Hannie Schaft, she's, if you can, yeah, right there, was born in 1920, which made her a few years older than the sisters. She too was raised in Haarlem, but had no connections with the Oversteegen family prior to the war. Her parents were Peter and Afsha Schaft. Peter was a teacher at an academy in the city, and like the Overstegens, had a strong attraction to socialist politics. He wrote occasional essays and articles for Dutch socialist newspapers. The Schaafs had an older daughter, Annie, who died during an outbreak of diphtheria when Hani was just 5 years old. With the death of this oldest girl, the Schaafs became extremely protective of Hani. Her friends and relatives recall her being bundled in layer upon layer of clothing, even in mild weather, to protect against the chills.
So Tim, can I interrupt you here? Is that okay if I interrupt?
Yeah.
So a couple things, man. So first, I just I'm gonna have to tease you just a little bit because I don't do anything with a script. Oh, I lost your camera, man. I lost your handsome face. But I don't know why. Maybe it's just me. Either way.
There you have me now?
No, let me go back. There you are. So I don't do anything with the script. So it's always interesting to me whenever I get to talk to you, because so much of your stuff is scripted. How much of that is because you work with major publishers, and how much of that is you doing what's comfortable for you?
A little of both. I don't usually work with scripts when I do this. I may do a reading which is obviously scripted from the book, but when I go out to meet people, it's usually. Do you want to just converse? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm happy to do anything. Yeah, but for me,
I'm willing to do that too. But what I have been doing so many of these Zoom events that it's easier to do I'm given a time allotment, and it's easier to script it and just sort of measure the time and that means and to fill in my allotted time with a script that I know how long it's going to last.
Yeah, man, I know that feeling very well. I know because a lot of times I'll get invited to do interviews and they'll have a target time, but the target time is humongous, like 2 hours. I got an email the other day from somebody asking me to do a 5-hour interview with them. And I couldn't, if you asked me to script a 5-hour interview, that'd be totally off limits. But yeah, when it comes to being unscripted, I love just the natural flow of conversation. And it gives me a chance to just totally derail your conversation, which I'm going to do right now. So you were talking about the 3 girls, and their ages were 14, 16, and how old was?
Well, Hani would have been 20.
Okay, and then you also said that that Truce and Freddie were staunchly anti-socialist and anti-Nazi.
Anti-fascist.
Thank you, anti-fascist. So here's my question. Here's my first question. As a human being, how much of their perspective do you think was actually theirs, and how much of their perspective was just what they had absorbed from their parents, their family, their community?
Well, I think it's sort of been not separable. I think that they were of that community and they were genuine. This is it's also impossible for me to say with total accuracy. I don't know what, and I'm not sure that they could coherently express their political viewpoints at 14 and 16. But they were of that life. They had no questions about that life. They loved their mother. They loved. I don't know if they didn't love the circumstances of their poverty or their standing in the community, but they certainly were not unhappy. They were not unhappy kids, and so they. As much as you can make that judgment on any 14 and 16-year-olds. Connie is a slightly different circumstance. She was by age 20. She's at the University of Amsterdam studying, and she by that time she had taken on the political interests of her father, who himself was at the socialist bent, and her interests were her political interests were leftist causes from the academy into college. She was fond of she was peace movements of the era. She was a fan of Mahatma Gandhi. She was she was a proponent of the League of Nations and people like Albert Schweitzer. She knew she had socialist and leftist interests. I would not say she was she didn't have that working class background in
Yeah.
sisters, so her leftist interests were less communistic than sort of socialistic.
Yeah. So you're giving into that habit again, where you were saying you get quiet at the end of your thoughts.
Okay. Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm gonna give you. Can you see me okay, Tim? Whenever I do this, that's gonna be my not so secret message to you to speak. But hey, so have you heard of the cognitive development cycle of the human brain, like how it breaks into different ages?
I have, but I know nothing about it. To be honest, saying yes, I've heard of it.
So it's fascinating as you explain these three girls, right? Because you have a 14 and a 16-year-old, and then you have a 20-year-old. Now the gap between 16 and 20 is only 4 years, which, I mean, there's a lot of married couples out there that have a gap of age greater than 4 years, right? And then the gap from 14 to 16 or 14 to 20 is only 6 years. So even still, that's really only, there's multiple married couples with a gap larger than that. But at that time of any human being's cognitive mental development, essentially the breaking points for how your brain works happen at age 3, age 7, age 13, and then age 19 to 21, somewhere in there. So what really happened is up till age 13, they're all older than 13. So by the time any human being in the modern day or in old times, right, when we hit 13, biologically, our brain switches to start choosing what information we allow our brain to absorb. So prior to age 13, essentially, we have very little control over what we absorb. So if a child under the age of 13 is exposed to balanced and fair conversation, they're gonna take on that information. But after age 13, we start to create those preferences, those patterns, those opinions that allow us to say, I believe this, but not that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's crazy because the girls, here you are between 13 and 21, all in that final stage. They are just now at the cognitive development cycle where they're starting to select what they choose to believe in. And they're making those decisions largely based off of the history of their life, where information, if they were in a home or a household where it was predominantly one-sided, then now they're putting their stake in the ground to just carry on the legacy of whatever information they have been fed.
Well, I can certainly buy into that. I don't know if I'm as determinative minded as all that you can lock it down to a particular age. You maybe know the social science more than I do. It just strikes me as a little speculative to assume these things are, as I said, determinative for all people through all ages, through extending back to a Dutch settlement in 1940,
it doesn't have to be an assumption when it's cognitive science, right? So it's just a developmental cycle of the brain. It doesn't mean it's permanent. We can all retrain our brain through neuroplasticity, so it's not permanent. But what's fascinating to me is that when this time period hits in World War II history, and when these three girls decide to take the path that they chose to take, they all happen to be inside that age range. Now, in their adventure, in their experience, they meet people from different age ranges, right? They engage with some children and they engage with some, senior adults. Yeah. And I'm sure that we'll get to that in our conversation. But when I start thinking right away of how this pertains to the current day, I think of all of those children, all of those young adults between 13 and 21 who are trying to formulate their opinion of our current world. And when you think about the fact that their opinion is being based on what they have experienced of our current world, now all of a sudden it starts to make sense, right? If they've never left a small town Alabama, or if they've never left inner city New York, right? They're going to have a completely different worldview, but cognitively their brain is at a place where they can selectively choose what to believe and what to reject.
Yeah, I can see that. That's an interesting notion. Yeah.
I mean, at least that's the stuff that jumps to my mind when I hear about the story. But let me jump back into the slides, man. So take us on through Hanny. The next slide I have here is up on screen.
Yeah, this is the Germans came to the Netherlands in May 1940 on their way to Belgium and France and sweeping through Western Europe. This is a shot of the Germans entering Haarlem, which was the home city of the sisters and Hani. By this time, Hani was in Amsterdam studying, and the sisters were still in Haarlem and witnessing this arrival. The upshot of all of this was that the Germans immediately established a oppressive regime. Originally they wanted to appease the Dutch, and they tried to encourage the Dutch to think of the Germans who had swept through their country in 5 days as their cousins from across the border, and that there was they would be treating the Dutch differently, and that there was a natural cultural cohesion in the two. The Dutch didn't buy it, essentially. I should backtrack and say there was a substantial portion of the Dutch population was sympathetic to fascist thinking, as was the case throughout Europe. There was at fascist elements, but I think it's safe to say the majority of the Dutch didn't buy it for a moment, but they didn't have an opportunity to form a resistance immediately. It took a long time for the Dutch resistance movement to get going, with the exception of people like the sisters, who almost immediately started to do the sorts of resistance that they had been doing before the invasion. The same things that I alluded to earlier, the sort of passing out of flyers and communist newspapers, which is one of these small acts of resistance that was nonetheless treacherous and a dangerous thing to be doing, but somehow they get pushed to the side when you talk about resistance, and they actually will get pushed to the side ultimately with the girls' stories because of the more dramatic modes of their resistance to come.
And this is one of those things that I find interesting about the world that we live in too. These little acts of resistance, not all countries respond equally to small acts of resistance.
Yeah.
You got countries like ours in the United States where, I mean, handing out flyers and standing on street corners is not against the law. But then you've got other places where, what jumps to mind is China, where if you are anti-regime in any way, you and multiple generations of your family become active targets. What was it like in Holland then?
It was dangerous. It was everything these girls did was dangerous, and they had to beware all the time of where they were, what they were doing, what their surroundings were, and just be careful. But one of the things that they did was they would wallpaper slogans, anti-Nazi slogans and pro-Soviet slogans up over Nazi bulletin boards and on walls, and that required them to go out with I'm not sure that they use this literally, but the old wallpaper brushes and that sort of stuff to the glues that were used. I actually think that's what they were doing. They were pasting these materials up, which is a timely thing. And you're a 14 and 16-year-old sisters, and you're out there standing against a wall as traffic is going by, and you're frantically trying to get these up. And they were very proud of that sort of work that they did, and if that sort of sloganeering got noticed by the general public, they were very pleased.
So let me interject some. This is interesting. This is fascinating to me. This is another excellent espionage kind of lesson.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the girls being hyper aware of their surroundings, right? Always knowing who's around and what's going on, because it's dangerous to hand out flyers. It's dangerous to put out, anti-German slogans, pro-Soviet slogans. As you kind of walk us through that, the term that we use in intelligence is called situational awareness. They have to have a heightened situational awareness. Now, most situational awareness that's out there is taught from the law enforcement perspective, which is basically 3 levels of situational awareness, right? They call it green, yellow, and red. Green means that you're situationally unaware. Yellow means that you are aware. Red means that you're panicked, right? You were caught off guard. Red is the dead zone, so nobody wants to be red. But in intelligence operations, which is much more akin to what these girls were doing, because they were running influence operations, that's what they were doing. It's clear and simple, right? Their resistance tactical strategy, or their resistance strategy, was influence, covert influence, overt influence, etc. But what they were doing was following a 5-step situational awareness model that actually includes something that we call being in the black. And in the black is when a covert operator has almost total control of their environment because of their hypersensitivity to their situational awareness. So just like your example, if they were in broad daylight with one person standing in front of the other person while the second person put up the poster, that is taking control of the environment. That is being in the black. It's called screening and activity, right? Yeah. People don't do that. Police officers don't have to do that, so they don't have that lexicon like an intelligence officer does. But it's so interesting. These girls stumbled into it. They built it through habit, or they built it through word of mouth in whatever resistance circles they were running with.
Well, as I suggested, they were sort of born to the breed, and their circumstances were again different than Hani's. The Oversteegen sisters were doing this stuff from their youngest ages possible. They, as soon as they could go out with their mother and pass out Communist Party literature, they were doing it. So they understood, and even this would have been in the 30s when they were out with their mother, and that was still a dangerous time. The communists were they weren't a banned party in the Netherlands, but they were not. They were a party that was controversial, and they were what they were doing was considered illicit, if not illegal. So they knew what they were doing. They knew that they had been raised in a particular kind of family that was doing particular, and if they weren't, if passing out literature wasn't illegal, what they were doing by housing refugees from Germany was illegal, and those refugees had to be hidden. So they were doing this stuff from very early age onward.
So if Freddie and Truce were kind of born into clandestine acts, what's this? How did Hani fall into it?
Well, that's a very good question, and she had sort of these middle class surroundings, but she was I think for her, it was more the circumstances of the time. When she went off to college in Amsterdam, this was just the beginning of the real chaos in Europe and the beginning of, as I mentioned, she would have been a sophomore in her second year at the University of Amsterdam when the Nazis invaded, when the Germans invaded, and there were she she had quickly made friends, particularly with a couple of Jewish girls. Uh, she was living with the Jewish girls in Amsterdam in 1940, and they felt the immediate effects of the Nazi oppression. So, and as a sympathetic leftist to begin with, as a sympathetic person, she was immediately drawn into sympathy with these Jewish girls who would soon be putting yellow stars on their overcoats, and prior to that there was this whole series of restrictive measures against Jews in the Netherlands that was imposed by the German led bureaucracy that took over the government in the Netherlands. So her radicalization came as a sort of measure of radicalization against Nazi oppression and German oppression. So those shots that I just had up, one of the things that in the presentation that I've gotten away from here, the ending drama of the invasion was the bombing of Rotterdam, which is a famous Dutch city, and that happened. The Dutch were slow to that's Rotterdam. The second shot is Rotterdam after the bombing. The bombing, I think, was on May 10th or 11th. And this was, I included this slide because it was just weeks before the Blitz would come to London, and this image of Rotterdam, the picture of Rotterdam in general became sort of a marker for everyone in England who was anticipating the German Luftwaffe coming and bombing London during the Blitz, which happened. So Rotterdam, sort of an object lesson of what was to come in London.
Yeah, I love the word that you used to describe Hani's transition, because you use the word radicalized.
Yeah.
And radicalization, right? And when you talk about radicalization as terrorist radicalization, or if you talk about it in terms of political radicalization, whatever it might be, radicalization starts from this foundation of a perceived injustice.
Yeah.
I don't know if I just froze or if folks can hear me. Can you still hear me okay, Tim?
Yep.
So it's a very prescribed methodology to radicalize somebody, which is why you have child soldiers in Africa, and it's why you have terrorists throughout the world. Radicalization is a prescribed process, and it all starts with manipulating this perceived injustice. And when you look at those two pictures, the two pictures of Rotterdam that you shared, I mean, just it's not hard to see how living in a place that looked like this, and then watching this place transform into this, that absolutely creates a sense of injustice, right? What's wrong with the world? How could this be happening? And that is the foundation for radicalization. Whether you agree or disagree with what the radical action is, that is the foundation of radicalization.
I think that is as a broad subject matter, I think one of the things that has drawn me to the writing about World War II is how dramatic that contrast has always been in my mind. And that contrast that I think that I have always wanted to impress upon people who I don't know if they appreciate the contrast, I want to impress upon them, it's been impressed upon me, that this is what was going on in World War II. You know, I think of, there are countless examples of chaotic moments and destructive moments in modern day life and in American life. But on a scale like those two images suggest alone, it's hard to find examples that are so drastic. And I guess that's, if anything has driven me to this area, it's probably trying to suggest what that meant to seeing those images, as you were suggesting, what they meant to the participants, the people who were living there, and how the extremes that would follow could happen.
Yeah, exactly. So so now we've got we've got the foundation for these three girls, two that were raised in this clandestine resistance world, and one that watched her world change from around her and chose to take a more radical path. But then, you know, all three paths, or two paths, however you want to look at it, now they all converge, and they're resisting the Nazi occupation of Holland. So let's talk about some of the operations that were involved, because I find those to be just absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to jump in the slides that you showed me, because one of the things that I love talking about is disguise. And you have this fantastic image of Truce and Hanny in disguise. Can you give us a little background? What is this activity that they're trying to take part in right now?
This is I imagine this shot, this photo was taken sort of I think it was taken expressly to show them in what they did on a daily basis. And this was, I think they made this photo to suggest their lives in the resistance. It's a shot of Truce is on the left, Hani is on the right. Truce has her hair tucked up under her cap, and Hani is dressed as a kind of a college student, whom resistance fighter. They would go out on a bicycle, the two of them together, and just scout around and do various activities. You can imagine Truce holding an ID there, some sort of ID that she's either her own, that is, or something that she has potentially swiped from someone. IDs were crucial parts of the getting around business in Harlem and Amsterdam. They were, you know, this is what they did. They worked together. And they would go out on assignments, and the assignments varied from going over to the North Sea to pedal around and look for German missile sites and German defense systems that were being built on the coastline, and then they would go back and report on these to their cell in Harlem, or they would be transporting weapons from Harlem to Amsterdam, or vice versa. Or they would, they wouldn't do this in costume, but they not in this type of costume, but they would transport refugees, usually Jews, from one safe location to another safe location. That was their life in the resistance, and bicycles were a crucial element of that. Anyone who's traveled to the Netherlands knows how integral bicycles are to the culture there.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things that just grabbed me right away about this. So first of all, the stories in the book, that in your book, where you detail some of their activities on bicycle in disguise, whether they're picking up bombs and delivering them, or whether they're transporting weapons in satchels on the sides of their bag, on the sides of their bicycles. Like it's just some pretty harrowing stuff, right? When they come face to face with Nazi blockades and basically just, walk headstrong right into the blockade and with the mindset that they're going to figure out what they have to figure out when the Nazis decide how much they're going to search. But what I love about the disguise element here is what you see here, Tim and everybody, is this is called level 1 disguise, also known as light disguise or throwaway disguise. There's no permanent change to the appearance of their physical features, right? So here's Truce on the left, and here's Hani on the right. Here's Truce and here's Hani in disguise. So what they've done here, and they had somebody with a good eye help them work through this level 1 disguise strategy, because Truce is a very cute female, right? You can see it here. She is clearly a female. However, those cute female features, like her forehead that's oversized and her oversized nose, her high cheekbones, these all lend themselves really well to a young male as well. So they tuck her hair away, they put a hat over the top of her head, and they break up a feminine figure with an oversized jacket, and now suddenly you have almost like a gender neutral or an ambiguous young boy that's kind of trapped being cute. And we've all met those baby-faced boys, and that's essentially what they've done here with the disguise, which is great because they're the two least threatening people in a resistance are a young boy and a female student. Nobody's on the hunt for a young boy and a female student. People are on the lookout for threatening looking older men and threatening looking or well-connected older women. This is not a threatening pair to see on a bicycle riding around.
And the roles that they played were as young lovers. That was precisely what they would do, and that was what they were indicated in this photograph. And it was, they had various disguises too. But one of the things that struck me early on in this story was how they not these two, not Hani and Truce necessarily, but Truce and 14-year-old Freddie could be chosen for resistance work by the cell in Harlem, and it was pretty well laid out in the literature of that cell and the memoir of Truce, which was one of my primary sources for the book. That the cell itself was looking for young girls to be part of the organization, because just as you were indicating, they like a young couple, two young girls were not threatening to the SS or the German armed forces that were hanging out, or the authorities in Harlem itself. There were a lot of Dutch police who were involved in maintaining the authority. They didn't suspect that two teenage girls were a threat. They didn't have a lot of respect for them as far as being a threatening influence to their circumstances. So they were allowed much more freedom of access and much more. They could bicycle around Harlem and not expect to be stopped for doing so. Two boys of their age would be a little more problematic for those authorities. So, and to take this one step further, there was to characterize the girls. The first time that they went out on an assignment which would involve an assassination. These two sisters went out together, and they were the plot was for them to seduce German officer in a Harlem tavern to bring him back to some woods that were some secluded woods in the city, so secluded woods in the city that where a third member of the party, the leader of the cell, would put a pistol to the guy's head and assassinate him. And the plot was to get the girls to bring him to the woods. And they dressed the girls up like German tarts, and they were supposed to be seductive, but they did this back at the cell hangout, and the fellow members laughed at the girls because they were such unlikely German Dutch prostitutes. They couldn't, as much as they wanted to. The girls were too youthful to sell even their fellow resistance fighters on them as seductive creatures. So but they finally went out, and in fact, it didn't take much for this German soldier to be seduced by the charms of truce. She brought him back to the woods, and just as they plotted, the German officer was killed by their resistance leader, and their intent was to collect the uniform and the pistol for further use by the resistance leaders.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating concept to think of Truce, who was, what, 16 or 17 at the time,
yeah,
to be facing death, taking deliberate actions that lead to the death of another person, which is really heavy, right? But it also opens the door to something fascinating about intelligence work that I think gets overlooked. And let me jump back to the screen share, because there's some great captures in the images here, right? So you see Truce here in disguise, but she's holding a document, and multiple times you reference in the book, in the story of the three girls, that they are collecting uniforms, they're collecting documentation, they're collecting maps, they're collecting information, and some of that information goes to a fabrication house where other people engineer fake documents, or they engineer passports or identification. And to every intelligence operation, there is so much more than just the operator in the field. There's a whole group of people that create the alias documentation, that create the travel, that create the fabricated cover legends, all the backstopping to support someone's cover, whether that's websites or whether that's pocket litter like business cards or credit cards or whatever else. There's a whole army of people that support the field officer. And because of that support network, that is a major reason why intelligence is so effective. Because in the field, face to face with your target looks and feels alone. And then they're looking at you and they are assuming that you are also like them, operating alone and independently. They don't realize that behind you is an almost unlimited network of skills and talent and passion and dedication that's supporting you being at the tip of the spear. That is the ultimate unfair advantage when it comes to stealing secrets or recruiting assets or whatever else it might be. In the case of this, there's an entire Dutch resistance force behind Truce when she went and appealed to this German officer or this German soldier. Yeah. He was just thinking it was one other person, but he couldn't have been more wrong, right? He lost his life thinking that it was just one other person, when in fact it was so much bigger.
Right. And that was, they understood, the girls themselves understood that too, because they wouldn't have been participating without that force behind them. I think it was also, for all resistance fighters, I think that it's necessary for not only for their spirit, but just for their day-to-day well-being, to realize that they have those allies in the resistance, to know that they're out there, that they are part of something that's fighting the oppression of the Germans.
So one of the things that I wanted to kind of ask about Tim, was what is this blueprint? I'm guessing this is one of the more sensitive documents that the girls were able to collect on their operations. But is this a rocket? Is it a
this is a blueprint for the V2, and you know what the V2 was?
Yeah, it was a Nazi generated cruise missile.
Yeah, it was supposed to win the war for the Germans, and it was introduced the first one was fired towards London in September 1944. And it was fired from a city called Wassenaar, which is near The Hague in the Netherlands. Wassenaar was a city that the girls were sent to multiple times, scouting for the location of this rocket, and it's in here simply as an example of what they were doing when they went out on their biking journeys on the North Sea. They were looking for. There was also in Harlem there was a submarine base and a base for a shipbuilding company that built. They were kind of a German PT boat was built at a shipbuilding facility just north of Harlem. This is the type of things that the girls would bike out to, and they would look for evidence of what the Germans were doing, and then come back and report to their cell. By this time, there was a sort of night and day difference in the resistance between from the post D-Day forward. That's when the link to the Dutch government and other resistance help from the Allied help became more prevalent within the Dutch resistance groups. So the connections became closer, and the need to get information from resistance fighters in the Netherlands became more pressing, and so the girls' role kind of changed a little bit from June 1944 to the winter, when it changed again.
So we're about to transition to kind of wrap up the end of the story, because these girls become recognized heroes for the Netherlands, for Holland.
Yeah.
And you have some great photos of them being honored and being celebrated. So for everyone listening in, this is the perfect time to tee up any questions you have for Tim and I as we kind of wrap up the story of these three girls. The details of their operations, from assassination to a hostage rescue to a sabotage and identity and document theft, all of that is really just beautifully researched in the book, Tim. And I really appreciate your storytelling style, because it's not dull or boring or academic, which is what really kills me about a lot of historians. So I very much appreciate that you avoid that. And I very much appreciate that you took the time to learn enough Dutch to be able to go back and reference the original Dutch documents that Dutch museums, I mean, in Holland, these girls are well known, but in the rest of the world, in the English speaking world, not so much. But this is my invitation for everyone. Chime in, send us your questions for Tim or questions for me. And Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kind of wrap up in just a few minutes where these girls, as grown adults and even older ladies, how their country honored them.
I am hesitant to give away one aspect of the story, but I actually the sisters made it out of the war and lived long and pretty fruitful lives. Truus became a well-known Dutch artist, a sculptor primarily, and she became a well-known figure late in life, and she was more open about her experiences. As I mentioned, she wrote a memoir that described her life in the resistance, and she was honored in Israel by the Avad Yishem, as was Hani. Uh, um, and but Hani was captured late in the war, and she was executed. Uh, this is an image of Hani in prison. She was captured in early April 1945. You know, so it was just 2 months before the end of the war, and she was taken out to the dunes by uh, firing squad, basically two SS officers, and was shot and buried in the dunes. Her grave became the center memorial site for a Dutch memorial cemetery honoring resistance fighters of the nation. Freddie, the second girl, second sister, was she was scarred a little bit by the war, not a little bit, quite a bit by the war, and had symptoms of PTSD. And she but she married and she had a family. Both of the sisters had families and both lived into the 90s. And I actually discovered their story when I read Freddie's obituary in the New York Times. Actually, my agent sent me the obituary in 2018. So she was just shy of 93. And the sisters, and I should say, Freddie became much more open about her experiences as she aged. And the two of them appeared frequently on Dutch documentary television, for instance, and they did interviews and became well known and were honored. I believe it was 1914. They were honored in 1914 by the Dutch Prime Minister. I forget the name of the award that was granted them, given them by, it was honoring them for their resistance work during the war. They were, and today they're all quite well-known figures in the Netherlands. Hani more so than the two sisters, primarily because of she had this fiery red hair that was a very distinguishing characteristic. And there was a book that was written after her execution, which became this well-known moment in the resistance and memorialized in this cemetery and by the Dutch nation in general. She became the subject of a book called The Girl with the Red Hair, which was a popular book and published in the mid-50s, and which also became a popular Dutch movie in the early 1980s. So everyone in the Netherlands seems to know the girl with the red hair. Many people know the sisters, but they're as I say, they're pretty well-known characters now.
But I mean, what I like about this is that it's we're walking through the life cycle of heroes, and that's what I find so fascinating about it, because there's always two sides to history, and there's always something that drives people's behaviors. And Germany was being driven by what they thought was a noble cause. Yeah. And likewise, you had a rebellion that was being driven by what we would call, what they wanted to believe was a noble cause. And then still mixed into all of that was the fact that they were actually trying to support communist-based beliefs, which were, again, in the 1980s and 1990s, became a huge debate for what is noble cause. So it's just, I just love the complexity of all this, because the common thread, the true glue that holds it all together is spy skills. And that's the piece that is just so fascinating to me about stories like this and other stories and even modern day espionage. I used in the field with CIA the same skills that they were using in the 1940s that they had learned in back alleys from their mom and dad.
Yeah.
And you know what? 30 years from now, new minted CIA and FSB and MSS officers are going to be out there using the same skills still, because the skills are timeless, right? The talent to be clandestine is a timeless talent. It doesn't change with technology. It doesn't change with opinion. It doesn't change with political belief. The way that you hide something from human beings is always the same, because human beings remain that consistent piece. I know you were uncomfortable when I made the assumption earlier. I'm going to continue making it. Like, human beings are a highly predictable creature. We're not that different from any other creature out there. It's just a matter of being able to identify the behavioral patterns. And that's what these girls did. What are the behavioral patterns of the Nazis? What are the behavioral patterns of a soldier? What are the behavioral patterns of a resistance? How do you fit inside that where you want to fit? And how do you stand outside where you want to stand outside?
I can buy that. You know, it's. I don't think that I am that resistant to the idea. I use the word determinative, and I'll use it one more time because it's. I think that while we are all predictive in the manner that you sent, you suggest. I don't think that I have a faith in human will to be not so determined. So I think I'll keep that and buy your predictive your suggestions.
Absolutely. It's all a matter of probabilities, right? All right. So I'm going to jump into some questions, Tim, so we can close with some questions. Folks, this is the time to jump into your Q&A if you have anything for me or for Tim, whether it's about the Dutch girls, whether it's about the spy skills we talked about, whether it's about espionage or something else. But let me go ahead and jump in. So from Anthony, Tim, how did the resistance go about recruiting under the Nazi regime? Do you know how they would recruit new resistance members when the Nazi regime was in place?
Yeah, in the case of the girls, as I mentioned, I write about this in the book. The leader of the Harlem cell, who was a man who was probably about 30 years old, and had connections to the Communist Party, and was loosely acquainted to the girl's mother, heard about them through the Communist Party cells in Harlem. And as I said, he was the guy who was looking for the young girls to be his eyes and ears in Harlem. And so he visited the girls one night, knocked on the door, and the mother answered the door and knew that he was on his way. Didn't know exactly what his intent was, but knew he was going to be talking to the girls. He came in and drew the girls aside and basically asked them if they were ready to do something a little more daring and dangerous than they had been doing, passing out flyers with their mother. And he gave them a couple of days, and he was, and again, this was taken from Truce's words. He basically said to them, "Are you willing to kill another human being?" Which, if you think about it, it's an astonishing question to ask two teenage girls in their living room, and they, they kind of said basically that, their jaws dropped. But, a couple of days later, they met with him again, and ultimately they agreed to be part of the cell and started doing work at the cell.
Yeah, I thought that was a really cool story, a segment in the book when that resistance leader came over to the house and had that exact conversation, right? Are you willing to kill another person? And I also thought it was really interesting to see your description of how the girls reacted at the time. So, but I mean, just awesome, a sign of the time, right?
Right.
So next question, Ben. Or I'm sorry, next question, Tim, from Ben. Did any iterations of the USSR's military or foreign intelligence services support communist-leading Dutch resistance? Did you find anything like that in your research, that the Soviets were supporting Dutch resistance?
I did not, and there were. I'm not going to be able to tell this story well because I don't know its details. But there had been. Let me approach this a different way. The communist, the Soviet example was a primary influence, particularly in the girls' lives. They were aware, and this goes back to uh, this notion of why employ teenage girls for this work. To the Communist Party in the Netherlands and elsewhere, it was a well-known fact that young girls in the Soviet Union were fighting on the front lines with their compatriots. And as an example, it was a sterling example of what a brave young communist girl, even in Western Europe, might do on behalf of the cause there. So the sisters were aware of what was going on there, and I think that had as much influence as any in helping them to stoke their courage and imagine life with a weapon in their hands.
Yeah, I would venture to say, Ben, that all resistance groups have some kind of covert funding and support. Whether that's hard cash, whether that's weapons, whether that's capabilities like creating a fake document, or even intel into being able to know where to look for anti-aircraft or armaments or whatever else it might be. There's almost always, wherever there's a volunteer resistance force, there's almost always some kind of back channel support to make sure that they are successful, because it's such a cost-effective and cost-efficient function for the opponent.
I'm sorry, Andrew. I think in the Netherlands, the British supplied most of that sort of outside support.
Perfect. Yeah, so it makes sense rather than the USSR.
Yeah, rather than.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. So just a quick comment from Ron, who talks about the awesome coping skills and constant awareness that these young girls had to exercise. So Ron, I'm going to go one step further. So when you're practicing situational awareness, especially when you're operational and you're in that black zone that I was talking about, Tim, to you as well, that level of awareness is typified with a almost extreme hyper awareness. And hyper awareness is just like any other kind of hyperactivity. It consumes resources at an exponential rate. The calories in your system, your hydration levels, your mental capacity, your ability to physically, your physical strength, all of those get consumed at a much higher rate when you're operating in the black, which is why most field operators don't flip themselves into a black state of awareness until the moment that they begin their operational act, whatever that act might be, dead drop, putting a flyer or a poster on a wall, whatever that might be, that is when we turn black. Leading up to that moment, we're in the yellow, and then coming out of that moment, we're in the yellow, specifically because that hypersensitivity is a draining experience. So I actually have a training course coming up here next week, Tim, called Streetcraft. And my Streetcraft course is a course where I teach people how to operate with human intelligence tradecraft on the street. And I host it here in St. Petersburg, Florida, and I'm expanding it into other cities. But one of the things that makes that course so powerful is that I teach people these 5 levels of awareness, and then I put them on the street under surveillance, and they have to execute clandestine acts in broad daylight, in public, right, on the street. And they absolutely feel the resource drain that comes from being in the black. They come back after running an operation, and they are just absolutely drained from wondering, like, who was following me? When were they following me? Did they catch me? Did they see me? Was I successful? Was I not? And it's just an awesome experience. that I host through my company, Everyday Spy. And if you want to check it out, or if anybody wants to check it out, just everydayspy.com/spy. And that is the whole purpose, is to give people that taste of the life of an operator.
You know, that's interesting. When you were telling that, I immediately flashed on an anecdote that again, Truce used in her book. And when she finally answered the question, do you think you're capable of shooting another human being? She flashed in her mind to a moment earlier prior to that conversation where she had been followed by someone. She was taking a young Jewish man from one location to another in Harlem, and they were pretending to be a couple walking arm in arm, and someone started to follow them, or so she thought. She was never certain who it was, but she was finally got the young man to the safe house and got home. And she went to answer this question, can I shoot someone? She flashed back to that walk, and she was probably in this state that you're talking about, and the question in her mind was, if that guy came up to accost us, would I have been able to shoot him? And she answered that in her mind, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. It's a fascinating experience that in the modern day we don't often get, because there's no need for that level of hypersensitivity until an emergency or a crisis happens. So we have a great question here, Tim, from April. April's asking more about disguise. So specifically, let me just read you what she says here, Tim. Tim, thank you for coming. Where can we go to buy your book? So can you just tell us real quick, Tim, where can they go to buy the book?
Oh, you can get it through Amazon. You can get it probably at your local bookstore. Publisher is Kensington Press. You can go online, look for the book there. You should be able to get it at any number of bookstores.
Yeah, it's a mainstream, massive publisher. Really kudos to you, Tim, for being able to create works of historical value that are going to long live past you or me or anybody else because of the publishers you're able to work with.
Thank you.
No, thanks to you, man. And then April's second question was more about disguise. So April, I'm pulling up on the screen right now. We talked about level 1 disguise, which is the specific level of disguise that you see here, where Truce and Hani, here's their true images, right? And then when they use level 1 disguise, which is also called light disguise or throwaway disguise, they don't change their physical permanent bodies or features at all. They just use accessories to break up their profile. So Truce looks like a male here, a young boy like we talked about. Hani looks like a college student. She puts her hair back with an oversized bandana. The attention of the eye goes to the bandana, not the hair color, not the hair length. She's wearing a large oversized jacket that goes all the way up to her neck. You can't really tell any physical features about her, whether she's got broad shoulders or sloped shoulders, or whether she has, whatever color of her skin might be. This is all level 1 disguise. Here's an example of what's known as level 2 disguise. So here, Hani physically alters her permanent physique by changing her hair color to black. It's a very, very basic form of what's known as level 2 disguise. But level 2 disguise is whenever you change your physical features to sustain an operation for weeks or months or possibly even years. So with men can grow a beard or grow a mustache or a goatee and keep it. They can dye their hair. They can wear, these are Hani's true sunglasses or glasses. You can see them here, also the same round shape and form. But you can don fake glasses, or you can don contact lenses that essentially allow you to change your eye color or change the makeup of your face for long periods of time by physically permanently altering the way you look. Men can shave their head. They can straighten their hair, whatever it might be. This is the place where you see people gain weight or lose weight. This is the place where you see people start to put thumbtacks in their shoes to make a long-term sustainable change. That's all level 2 disguise. And then level 3 disguise is not mentioned anywhere here in this slide deck. And it's the rarest form to find because that's where you start including prosthetics. You put fake tattoos or some sort of prosthetic ears, prosthetic noses. You put on fake wrinkles into your face. You might change the color of your teeth. All of those are, again, short-term disguise, much like level 1 disguise, not long-term. Level 2 is your only real true long-term disguise. But those are your 3 levels, April, your 3 levels of disguise, kind of in a nutshell. Level 1, 2, and 3 light disguise is level 1, a long-term disguise is level 2, and your prosthetics are all level 3. From Hans, Tim, Mr. Brady, thank you for telling the story. Andy, thank you for bringing Mr. Brady to us. Hans, you're welcome. Thank you very much. April also gave a big thank you, Tim. And then lastly, I don't know if you have an answer for this one, Tim, but it's a good question. Again, from Anthony, what kind of intelligence was gathered about concentration camps in Europe, if any, and what action was taken based on that intelligence? Did you find anything about that in your research, sir?
Not in concentration camps in general. There were the camps in the Netherlands were sort of way stations to the concentration camps. There was a camp called the WWII camp, which was primarily Dutch transgressors, and then there was a camp I just blanked on its name, in the northeast corner of the country, which was the way station for Jews, and from which the thousands and thousands of Jews in the Netherlands were shipped to the concentration and death camps from there. There were no concentration camps and no death camps in the Netherlands proper to speak of. But there were these 2 camps, which were the primary way stations for trips to concentration camps.
Yeah. Well, Tim, thank you very much for your time, sir. And everyone, thank you very much for joining. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Lots more compliments coming in, Tim. It sounds like we have a lot of folks who are going to be finding their way over to your book and hopefully become more familiar with a lot of your World War II work, man. It's super cool stuff.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure being with people. Thanks for everyone attending.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Take care, Tim.
Bye-bye.